All right, dear friends, I hope you can hear me all right. Once again, good morning. When I was a university professor, I typically gave my talks ad lib, and I would dance around the classroom and do entertaining things to keep the students interested in what I was saying. But I'm getting older now, so I write things down these days, and I've written down what I'm going to say this morning. But nevertheless, I will try to keep it as lively as possible. So, I've given this talk the title for this morning, tongue-in-cheek, a little bit whimsically, The North American Scholar. And that may mean something to some of you. When I planned this conference, we chose to emphasize North American literatures, and how persons in this section work with and within those literatures. But this morning, I need to zoom, there's that word, I need to zoom out a little bit and take a wider view and to give you some idea, in my own words, I'm speaking for myself this morning, of what this section is and how it works and what it means to me to be a North American anthroposophist active in the section for the literary arts and humanities. And I feel I need to do that because I feel that from a literary standpoint, it is very complicated to be a North American anthroposophist active in the section. Aside from knowing what Rudolf Steiner wrote and said and did, and knowing about the history of the anthroposophical movement and its antecedents, you also need familiarity with German literature that influenced Rudolf Steiner. And I know, quite frankly, that I upset some people when I say that. When I remind them that anthroposophy is a German affair, that it has its roots in German literature, philosophy, and world outlook, that it roots itself very firmly in the age of Goethe and Novalis. But from a literary point of view, that is certainly the case. Now, if you're in biodynamics, for example, that may not make so much of a difference to you where it comes from. But from a literary standpoint, and we are the section for the literary arts and humanities, this is not a society event. From a literary standpoint, this is certainly true and must be taken into account. So I always like to begin there. But let me immediately add that in addition to at least some familiarity with that distant German literary world and how Rudolf Steiner worked with that literature, you also need, I think, and most importantly, to be a citizen of our globalized 21st century. And you need, in my opinion, to have opened yourself to all the disparate and contradictory literary and spiritual and cultural influences that accord with the vibrant spirit of our time. Now, Northern California, the Pacific Rim, the ring of fire on which we live in a general sense, I feel that that is an ideal place for a 21st century North American anthroposophist. I think there are few places in the world that are more diverse, more eclectic, more confusing, and nuanced in the range of voices and poetic themes, and in the conflict of traditions, old and new. The windows here are wide open in many directions, north, south, east, and west. And this is a vast landscape, speaking of this Pacific Rim, which, despite all the attempts to pave it over and silence it, still sings in the blood and whispers to the soul, very much alive. It's a place, as you know, that has always attracted literary pioneers and oddballs from all parts of the continent and the world. Many of them, as I said, were eccentrics. They were what we Californians currently call disruptors. And when they got here, they often felt that they had pushed as far west as they could go. They had come to the end of it. And they were transformative as a result. And this ring of fire was for them a kind of alchemical crucible, I think you could really say, in a literary sense. So, let me just go over here. I put together for this conference, as I said a moment ago, this little book for you, something to hold in the hand, and to show how the section group, section work in different parts of the country is completely different. You shouldn't think that the section is monolithic. I'm speaking now about how the section in my neck of the woods works in Northern California. And I put together this little book to show you something that you could have in your hand about that, how that work has been done. There's a poem in this book by the Beat poet Lew Welch, written to celebrate Mount Tamalpais, which is indeed the presiding mountain spirit for our event. And you can get a copy of this book. As I said, the printing cost is $5. If you want to just take one, take one. It's on the book table, and Rachel can help you with the books. But now, since I'm a 21st century anthroposophist, with 1 foot in the old worlds and 1 foot in the new worlds, I want to start this morning with a verse by the poet Novalis. And it's a verse that sits very well, I feel, with our conference title, which is The Genius of Language. And it speaks to a theme of wiggliness. I used that word a moment ago, wiggliness, wiggling. Or another way to express that is circle and line. And I highlighted that theme in this book, and I'll talk about wiggliness a little bit more. But right now, here is Novalis. Speaking and writing is a crazy state of affairs, really. True conversation is just a game with words. It is amazing the absurd error people make of imagining that they are speaking for the sake of things. No one knows the essential thing about language, that it is concerned only with itself. This is Novalis. That this is why it is such a marvelous and fruitful mystery. For if someone merely speaks for the sake of speaking, he utters the most splendid original truths. But if he wants to talk about something definite, the whims of language make him say the most ridiculous false stuff. Hence the hatred that so many serious people have for language. They notice its waywardness, but they do not notice that the babbling that they scorn is the infinitely serious side of language. That's Novalis. So, dear friends, looking out this morning, I see we are a very mixed crowd, and that is great. Some of us are quite intimately associated with the section for the Literary Arts and Humanities, and I should add the School for Spiritual Science, and are quite intimately knowledgeable about Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy. But some of us are only passingly familiar with the section or the school or Rudolf Steiner or anthroposophy, and some of us may not have concerned ourselves with anthroposophy at all. But one thing that we do have in common, however, I suspect, is an enthusiasm for literature and poetry, and for the humanistic, life-affirming disciplines that arise from this enthusiasm. And Rudolf Steiner, as you know, had that enthusiasm also very much. And I strongly suspect that we all feel deeply connected to the theme of this conference, but each in individual ways, and that we come together commonly to celebrate poetic language and the literary imagination or the genius of language, however diversely and widely this is understood. I'd also wager that most of us, if not all of us, have had life-transforming destiny experiences with poetry, the creative word, with imaginative language and stories. Perhaps you are a writer, or a poet, or a novelist, or an editor, a playwright, or a scholar in the humanities. perhaps as a reader, a certain poem or novel, or courses in the humanistic disciplines have been peak experiences for you. Perhaps a certain story struck you very deeply to the core and wounded you at just that right moment of your life and determined your life destiny. Or perhaps you are a writer like me, or on a quest to magically transform your life into a meaningful story or novel or poem or fairy tale, as Novalis would say, to transform it through the alchemy of imagination, through storytelling and language. And I know I have had and am still having that experience. And I can tell you for sure, I would not be standing up here in front of you today if I had not had such experiences and had not continued to have them. It's the only reason I'm here. My life, and I'm sure many of us could say this as well, would lack all meaning and hope if that were not the case. And as I say, I bet that many of us sitting here in the sanctuary this morning and coming from the most diverse and varied backgrounds would not be who we are today without a singular and magical experience with the creative word and with stories that we have heard and written and worked with. Well, that is what this conference is about, in my opinion. It's not about specific authors or national literatures or bioregional literatures or philosophies or linguistics or how to parse the meanings of specific texts in specific situations and context, or to line up a certain text with the wisdom teaching of Rudolf Steiner. Well, it is and it is not, of course. For me, it is mostly about the elusive quality and specialness of our unique experiences with creative language, aka poetry, and the humanistic disciplines, of course. In our section meetings, if you've attended any of them on Zoom, the ongoing meetings, I like to say that we are the shepherds of stories. And this conference is an attempt to speak about stories and the mystery of what is really undeniably for many persons who play with language and who shepherd stories, what is for them a spiritual, and dare I say, but I will, even a mystical experience. So to explain myself better this morning, I chose 3 poets, aka creative writers, as examples. Now, you might be disappointed, or you might even get mad, because, I don't have my prop. Hang on, I'm just going to walk over here, as I do in the classroom. And the students would say, what's going on? Because the 3 writers that I chose to talk about this morning are not Americans, although of course we will be discussing American literatures throughout the 8 days of the conference. But right now I want to talk about Kathleen Raine and Novalis and William Blake. Kathleen Raine, Novalis, and William Blake. Blake, of course, is a poet and visual artist who has a very deep spiritual affinity with this wonderful Swedenborgian sanctuary in which we find ourselves today. And Novalis, of course, is the poet, the herald of anthroposophy, who also stands, I should say, in a spiritual relationship to Swedenborg. Blake and Novalis were contemporaries, and I call them spiritual brothers. They never read or knew about each other, but nevertheless, they drank from the same spiritual source spring. And Kathleen Raine, you may not know her, I'm sure most of you do, however, is my 3rd example. For those who are unfamiliar with her, she was a scholar and a poet of the modernist era of the 20th century, deeply inspired by William Blake. Kathleen Raine was one of the outstanding Blake scholars of the 20th century. I don't think she knew much about Novalis or Rudolf Steiner. She was very strongly rooted in the poetry of England, but not as well read in German early Romantic literature and poetry, which is the literary source spring for Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy. In fact, to my knowledge, Kathleen Raine never concerned herself with anthroposophy, although she certainly had read very widely in the literature of theosophy and spoke about the theosophical enlightenment in relation to Blake and other poets such as Yeats. Now, this points to an awkward and unfortunate literary disjunction between theosophy and anthroposophy. And that's one reason that I want to include Kathleen Raine today, along with Novalis and Blake. Another reason that I invite her to be with us in this meeting today is that she was a poet and a scholar. Poet and scholar. And that is what I think we try to do in the section for the Literary Arts and Humanities, at least in my neck of the woods. We strive to bring together the artist-poet and the spiritual scientist, the spiritually and bodily awake poet and the rationally, logically awake, clear-minded meditant. Here's another fragment by our friend Novalis that we often use in our ongoing section meetings. It's his attempt to define the literary arts. He says, Novalis, everything that a scholar does, says, speaks, suffers, hears, etc., must be an artistic, technical, and scientific product, or some such operation. He speaks in epigrams. She acts in a play. He is a dialoguist. She lectures on treatises and sciences. He relates anecdotes, stories, fairy tales, novels. She perceives poetically. If he draws sometimes as an artist, sometimes as a musician. Her life is a novel, and that's why she sees, hears, and reads everything precisely in this manner. In short, the true scholar is the completely developed human being who bestows on whatever they touch and do a scientific, idealistic, and syncretistic form. Now, Kathleen Raine, to my mind, is a very helpful example of the literary and spiritual ideal that Novalis expresses here. She was a poet, and she trained as a scientist, and she forged a career as a literary scholar. I would say that thanks to her tireless scholarly interpretive work with William Blake and other poets, she kept alive for many people an appreciation of poetry as an inspired spiritual activity. Kathleen Raine tirelessly reminded many readers that the materialist worldview of positivist scientism and its reified ego identity, I might add, is a very recent cultural aberration, a proud bully, inflated with Faustian ambitions of narcissistic grandeur. Kathleen Raine tirelessly reminded readers that there is an older, quieter, more authentic spiritual view of the world and the human being that aligns with the poetic spiritual teachings of the world and human being. And that this view of the human universe is one that she called tradition, and others have called the perennial philosophy or theosophy or anthroposophy or even the lost wisdom of the imagination. All these different ways of referring to this mysterious it are ways of speaking, as Novalis said, about the spiritual world. The spiritual world is, in fact, already open to us. It is always open. If we were to suddenly become so SM-plastic to perceive it, we would perceive ourselves in a spiritual world. Now, another reason that I have invited Kathleen Rain into our conference this morning is that I think it is important that our section turn outward toward the world and welcome new colleagues, past and present, dead and alive, new friends and colleagues who might not be aware of anthroposophy or who might be inclined to avoid or reject anthroposophy or Rudolf Steiner for a variety of well-reasoned social, political, historical, or cultural reasons. Finally, I also think that Kathleen Rain's work and her example and her outlook on the human being, poetry and spirit, can help us in our literary section to articulate a methodology, and that is to say, to help us explain to ourselves and to others how we work with literatures and the humanities and what it is that we bring to the table that is uniquely of value. Now, we've had that sort of discussion in our section meetings about methodology many times. For example, we discussed literature within the context of spirit remembering when we discussed Rudolf Steiner in the context of literary modernism. At that time, we discussed the idea that the reading of literature and the study of literature and the doing of literature can foster what persons in an earlier century called, or like to call, clairvoyance. That is to say, clear seeing, abilities to empathically dialogue with other places, other beings, other cultures, other times, and other minds. Abilities to dialogue with the dead, to journey out of body, to other places, other times, and other minds. In an imaginal sense, my friends, as persons of literature, we cultivate those abilities. And it's not as mysterious or woo-woo as it might sound. In fact, from a literary standpoint, this is a common feature that we have as persons of literature due to our human beingness in the world. Fred Dennehy, for example, one of my section colleagues who can't be with us today on the leadership team, he talked about this, for example, when he talked about Shakespeare. Fred, you may know, is a Shakespearean actor and playwright these days. He likes to talk about Shakespeare's ability to get outside his own personality, to inhabit other minds, other places, other times. Shakespeare does this, you probably know, so successfully that it's almost rather impossible to pin down the personality of Shakespeare. He was too wiggly. And this wiggly capacity of the imagination is a quality that the poet John Keats called negative capability. Fred liked to talk about that. And Keats referred explicitly to Shakespeare as his example, and I'll paraphrase Keats. He said, "It struck me what quality went to form a person of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean negative capability. That is, when a human being is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason." Now, as you know, maybe you don't, but I'll tell you, Rudolf Steiner never gave a course of lectures for our section, as he did, for example, for speech and drama, or eurythmy, or agriculture, pedagogy. He never told us what to do or how to do it. Maybe he didn't have time to do this before he died. Or perhaps, as a senior colleague and mentor of mine suggested to me several times, and it really shocked me and surprised me when she said this. She said, perhaps Rudolf Steiner thought that, well, since we are the section of poets, we should be competent to figure this out for ourselves. After all, you know, Rudolf Steiner had enormous confidence in poet, novelist, playwright, editor, essayist Albert Steffan, who was our first section leader. And Steiner made the comment that Albert Steffen was an anthroposophist before he was born. Contemplate that for a moment. It raises the interesting question, well, why didn't I choose the Swiss poet Albert Steffen for today's discussion as an example, instead of, an offbeat Kathleen Rain? Well, Albert Steffen's work and life trajectory, it indeed resembles Kathleen Rain's in a literary sense, in respect to the modernist moment of the 20th century. And one could indeed profitably compare these two modernist individuals. I might, if we were doing a class, I might assign that to you as a topic. But my answer this morning is, number one, Albert Steffen is almost completely unknown to contemporary English readers and even to many 21st century American anthroposophists. And in fact, these days, I would say he's probably quite unfamiliar, if not unknown, to many German readers. And number two, Albert Steffen is intimately connected to the very challenging and difficult history of the Anthroposophical Society. And this makes it tricky to approach him, especially for those who don't read German or who don't have a scholarly familiarity with the history of the Anthroposophical Society in respect to the social, political, cultural turmoil of the 20th century. So again, for my section colleagues in the audience, you might challenge me and say, okay, Steffen, leave him out. But why didn't I choose Friedrich Hebel as an example instead of Kathleen Rain? Hebel led the section after Steffen's death, and Hebel even lived for a time in Northern California, up by the Mount Shasta area, where he worked on his book, The Gospel of Hellas. One day I want to take a literary field trip up there with a group of people just to commemorate that. But anyway, my response to that question is, while I greatly admire Friedrich Hebel, and I have indeed benefited enormously from his scholarship, nevertheless, Hebel was not a practicing poet or novelist or dramatist, as was Steffen. And that's not a criticism, since, as you know, you can experience it right now. I'm a retired university professor, a talking head. I have my degree and scholarship and all that. And our section is a home for professors of literature and many other academic disciplines that align with the humanities and the liberal arts, as it should be. But speaking now as a poet and a novelist, I wear several hats. I think it's too easy and misleading to define our section as an academic enterprise solo. We should reserve an important place at our round table for the art and doing of poetry, for the poet. But what do I mean by poetry? Thus, I return to Kathleen Rain, a poet scholar who explored this important question, what is poetry, extensively during her lifetime. And moreover, her attempt at a definition of poetry aligns with attempts by poets such as Novalis, such as William Blake, such as many others, poets whom we have discussed in many of our meetings. For example, I wrote this book. I did this little translation and wrote an afterword. It's of the poet, that fairy tale which has the name, I've given it the name Atlantis. I believe it's chapter 3 in the Novalis novel, Heinrich von Ofterdingen. And in the afterword to this little book, I mentioned Kathleen Rain and I quoted her in an attempt to help explain what this understanding of poetry that she had, and which Novalis had, and which William Blake had, and which probably Shakespeare had, what that notion is all about. Now, a term that Novalis uses interchangeably with poet is magical idealist. And in many respects, the novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen, in which we find this fairy tale, that novel is a how-to manual, a do-it-yourself manual, for those who wish to learn to become magical idealists, aka poets. That's how Novalis would put it. So, like Kathleen Raine and William Blake, Novalis sees the poet as much more than just a clever or skilled versifier or best-selling author. He really redefines poetry somewhat in the manner as the Buddha redefined Dharma. He redefines poetry as something basic to our human beingness in the world, something that is intrinsic to our human nature, although we may not know that. So what then is poet in this wider human spiritual sense? Well, in the novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen, the master poet Klingsor, funny name for us, Klingsor, in the novel gives young Heinrich many hints throughout the book. And one hint he gives very clearly and directly in chapter 8. He says, "It is really quite unfortunate," said Klingsor, "that poetry has a highbrow reputation, and that poets are set apart as special types. There is nothing so very mysterious about it. Poetry happens as a natural function of the human mind. Does not every human being strive and poeticize at every moment?" So let's linger on those last two sentences just a bit. Poetry happens as a natural function of the human mind. Does not every human being strive and poeticize at every moment? Well, here, Novalis points to the early Romantic understanding of imagination. And I'm sure the friends who built this building shared that understanding of imagination. You can just feel it radiating out of this space from every corner of the structure. Kathleen Raine likewise shared that understanding based on her long familiarity with the poet William Blake. These days, because of scientism and its henchmen, known as materialist economics, these days we have a very cramped, or wayward, might be the better word, very cramped and wayward notion of the meaning of imagination. And for many of us, to imagine means to conjure up something fantastical or unreal, something subjective or arbitrary, and maybe even dangerous and antisocial. But Kathleen Raine and others like her remind us that the early Romantics, such as Blake and Novalis, had a radically different understanding of imagination, as did Rudolf Steiner. Novalis asserts in the novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen that it is by means of our free and ethical poetic imagination and attention, that esemplastic power, that the human being interprets and creates her life world and finds her way home. That home is a big word for Novalis. According to Klingsor, the human being is not a passive recipient of sensory stimuli, knocked about willy-nilly. No. We are active makers, whether we know it or not. Active makers, that's an Aristotelian word there, intimately involved with this world-creating, world-renewing, world-destroying affair of knowing and remembrance. There's nothing very mysterious about it, said Klingsor. As we live and strive, imagination weaves meaning like a poet crafting a poem, for better or for worse. In this sense, the so-called materialist prison that appears to restrict us so tightly is in fact, according to the master poet Klingsor, you might want to argue with him, but according to the master poet Klingsor, this prison is not imposed upon us by mysterious others, but it is a prison that we have built skillfully and magically by ourselves, cooperatively, brick by brick. And it is, you might say, I know this is going to sound uber romantic, but it is, in a certain sense, bad poetry, a failure of imagination, or bad fairy tales. Kathleen Raine reminds us that William Blake called the poet an awakener. So, to what are we awakened, you might ask? Well, in her essay, The Use of Poetry, which is found in this book, she attempted several explanations. I'll read one attempt. Blake called the poet the awakener. For is there not in us all something we feel we have forgotten, which we seek to retrieve from our unawareness, to remember, as Plato says? Plato's word is anamnesis, which means literally unforgetting, spirit remembrance. For Plato taught that the soul knows everything, but has in this life forgotten what it knows in eternity. Inspired poetry awakens us to the recollection of what is already within us, bringing with it a kind of recognition, as if we had always already known these things. I know when I speak to my anthroposophical friends, sometimes they say to me, oh, that lecture that I read by Rudolf Steiner, it was as if I had always already known that, and suddenly it has awakened in me again. Well, that is the thought here from Kathleen. Inspired poetry, she says, is not difficult in the sense of requiring many notes before we can understand it. On the contrary, what is inspired from this deep source comes with a sort of simplicity, like the music of Bach or a melody of Schubert, a sense of familiarity, like the landscapes and the fools and angels of Cecil Collins, almost one might say of a homecoming to our native country. As Novalis liked to say, where are we going then? Always towards home. Now, to finish up this talk and round things out, I'm almost done. I've extracted a few key statements by Kathleen, and I'm hoping that this very short selection will inspire you, perhaps, to travel a little bit with Kathleen. And a good place to start, I'm not plugging the book, full disclosure, no proceeds here from the publishers of this book to me. I just like the book. But it might be a good place to start as a collection of her essays, or why not cut to the chase? You can listen to Kathleen explaining her ideas in her own voice on YouTube. Click, click. So the first statement that I want to share with you from her concerns a word that was quite important to Kathleen, and it sort of resonates with this building. Tradition, that's the word, tradition. She says, I inherited in my measure the unbroken tradition of civilized Europe, as this has descended from Homer and the classical world, through Rome and Christendom, and English literature from Chaucer to the 20th century, each age inheriting and building and adding to the heritage of the past. She says, that past was, for the educated, I say was, I hesitate to say is, that past was an extended present in whose wholeness each generation lived. Now, this idea of alignment with tradition is, for some of us old folks, a very attractive proposition, and it may even appear self-evident. Tradition is a very important word, especially in the modernist era of the 20th century, which is the era of Kathleen Raine and Rudolf Steiner. But do we understand tradition historically as the Western literary tradition, Homer to Goethe to Emerson, for example? Or can we start to learn to speak in a more global and diversified sense? Do we have that spiritual agility yet? But there's another way to respond to this quote by Kathleen about tradition. And I mentioned this other response when I spoke about spirit remembering in many previous meetings of this section. When I talked about this theme of spirit remembrance, I pointed to Owen Barfield, and we have a very noted Barfieldian scholar in our audience today, Jeffrey Hippolito, who's the son of a dear friend and colleague of mine, Jane Hippolito. I pointed to Owen Barfield as a modernist contemporary of Kathleen Raine, and Barfield talked about the human being as a time being. Barfield said, "We are sometimes asked to say, in a few words, what anthroposophy is. It is, of course, impossible. But let us in this context say that the kernel of anthroposophy is the concept of the human being's self-consciousness as a process in time, with all that this implies." Now, from a spiritual literary point of view, this notion of the human being as a time being, it opens many vistas. When we engage with a literary tradition and its stories, are we bounded by the relative limitations of our culturally, politically conditioned here and now? Or are we learning to grow wings of spirit that allow us to fluidly shape-shift into other times, other minds, other places, other humanities, or other lifetimes, or lifeways? If indeed we are time beings, as Barfield says, what is the role of spirit remembrance as we come to self-knowledge? Now, from this standpoint, one might indeed argue that tradition is not a set of canonical books by DWMs, but something more fluid and electric and eclectic, like nodal points of ley line energies to which we must learn to attune. Perhaps the energies that awaken us as we swim in particular rivers or estuaries or traditions, so to speak, or walk upon our sacred mountains. Perhaps these might be thought of as vortices of spirit power, or, to shift the metaphor, energy nodes, such as we find at ancient megalithic sites, or down along the coast of Big Sur, or up on Mount Tamalpais, these crystal mountain power points, where the veil between the worlds grows very thin, and where one can hover and fluidly trespass many assumed boundaries and identities, if one learns how. For a magical idealist, aka poet, the world is wiggly, and the ancestors are always close. The veil between the dead and the living is very thin. Kathleen Raine is well known for her Temenos journal and for her Temenos Institute, which encourages the quest and questioning for the perennial wisdom tradition of the being human. But the main point that I want to hold in mind here today by mentioning Temenos is that Kathleen says that the arts should properly be found within the precincts of the sacred. Key word, sacred. But she says very clearly that she does not mean sacred in a religious sense. Like William Blake, Kathleen Raine might be said to be Christic, but not Christian. I would make the same argument for Novalis. Blake, for example, made frequent use of Christian vocabulary, but he was no friend of organized Christianity. He even turned on Swedenborg after a while. And by that I mean Blake was no friend of the Christian religion of his time. He's really quite a bit like Nathaniel Hawthorne in that regard, or Herman Melville. And I'll talk about Melville and Hawthorne when I get to Toronto. Blake was Christic but not Christian. And how do we understand that distinction, or dare we? Now, a few more quotes from Kathleen Raine as I conclude. And I'm almost done, I swear. In an essay with the ironic title, The Use of the Beautiful, she quotes approvingly a shamanic statement by the Irish poet George William Russell, otherwise known as A.E. Yeah. And here's the statement that she quotes. A.E. said, "One of the very first symptoms of the loss of soul is the loss of a sense for beauty." And then Kathleen explains. She says, "The beautiful, then, is the active principle in any work of transforming power, summoning us to self-knowledge of the innate human norm to which we always tend, but from which we always deviate." Now, personally, I find a great deal of inspiration and consolation in the fact that Rudolf Steiner named our section the section for the beautiful sciences, Die schöne Wissenschaften. That is its name, or its original name, and we call ourselves Literary Arts and Humanities now. I like to call this name Beautiful Sciences, I do, our spirit name, or Dharma name, if that works for you. But this Dharma name, Beautiful Sciences, it does not communicate at all very well in English. And so it was rightly changed to the Literary Arts and Humanities. So you could say we have an esoteric name in this section, and we have an exoteric name. Now, while it might appear that something has been lost with the English translation, I rather think not. The name of the section in English is more inclusive and comprehensible worldwide, given the fact that English, for better or worse, is now our de facto global language in common for the time being. And it's more useful, Literary Arts and Humanities, in that context for our 21st century and its challenges. But in the background, beauty, like an ever-present spirit guide, inspires our quest, our striving, and our methodology. Now, before I end here, I just want again to present you and remind you about this little book that I worked really hard to prepare for this conference at the last minute, the very last minute, at the suggestion of my dear wife, Marion. It was her idea. There you are. Hey, okay. Marion's idea. She's a visual artist, and actually that's one of her paintings on the cover here that I used. And she shepherds the fairy tale group that meet for the section, that meets regularly in our garden. She'll talk about that, we'll talk about it later. So I titled this little book Celebrating the Mountain because, as I said, our conference stands in very close physical and spiritual proximity to Mount Tamalpais. You may not know this, but for decades now, Mary Jo participated back in the day. For decades now, Mount Tamalpais has played a very significant role in my section work in Northern California. And because I am a poet student of Gary Snyder, I learned in the early days from Gary to circumambulate Mount Tamalpais as a poetic ritual of appreciation and acknowledgement, as a kind of spiritual training, as it were, something to do. I brought this activity into the section work decades ago, as I said, as part of my interest in bioregional poetics and American literatures. Accent on the plural of the noun, literatures. When I went to school as a young Heinrich long ago, I was told that there was this thing called American literature, and that it mostly had to do with the so-called American Renaissance of the 19th century, and that you could study this canonical period and its representative writers to understand what it meant to be an American in an ideal sense. I don't believe that anymore. I've lived too long in Alta California and on the Ring of Fire on the Pacific Rim. At this point in my life, to be honest here, folks, I'm much more influenced by, say, Jaime de Angulo, who was a Spanish-French immigrant to Big Sur, a linguist, anthropologist, storyteller, horseman, poet, shaman, drunkard. I'm more influenced by Jaime than I am by F.O. Matheson and his tribe. Matheson, in case you don't know, he's the famous, rightly so, famous scholar who came up with the literary term American Renaissance, and he held up for praise the Big Five: Whitman, Melville, Hawthorne, Thoreau, Emerson. I love the Big Five, don't get me wrong. Sounds like a super fantastic outlet in a mall. But I have come to agree with Alan Watts, a famous British transplant on Mount Tamalpais. He was, I guess you could call Alan an invasive species. I agree with Alan that the world is odd and wiggly and unnumerable, to coin an awkward term. And I put that poetic notion into this book, and I'll let the book speak for itself. I used Alan and his spiritual bro, Ralph, and that's why I put these quotes at the beginning of the book, one by Ralph and one by Alan. Ralph Waldo Emerson, from the poem Uriel, said, "A line in nature is not found. Unit and universe are round. Line in nature is not found. Unit and universe are round." And I followed that with this quote by my friend Alan. Life is wiggly. And it isn't wiggly just because that is the easiest way to be. It is wiggly for the pure love and beauty of wiggling. So that last quote is, by the way, is from Alan's autobiography, In My Own Way. And aren't we all really in our own way? You get the pun there, I hope? For me, this thing that Watts called wiggliness and that Emerson called circle and line. You can, by the way, read that poem by Emerson in that book if you want. Wiggliness, circle and line, these are important themes. And I'd even go so far to suggest that when we really get down to it today, this conference that celebrates poetic language and the literary imagination and the genius of language and the spirit of place is all about really wiggliness and circle and line in an archetypal spiritual sense. We're going to blow this up into some platonic ideal dimension and meet as spirit beings in that ideal platonic academy in the sky. We would discuss circle and line and be saying the same thing. But then Alan would show up and wiggle around. The notion of circle and line, as I said, is one that I explored in that book, and you can take a look at it. The book is really meant to be a companion for our conference, so please have at it. And Rachel will help you with the books and point you toward it. All the proceeds, by the way, I should emphasize this, all the proceeds from that book or any of the other books by me that are available here, they all go to the section, not a Firmich. All goes to the section. Okay, now I'm going to stop. That's when my students always went, oh, thank God. Time to put down your iPhones and get ready for the next chapter, because later Christiana's going to talk about beauty, truth, and goodness. Remember, that's another one of the legs of our conference here. And as well as a very important theme for our section. So I thank you very much for your attention, and let's go have fun today.